Can a single book of poems really change the world? Well, you might be surprised. Back in 1798, a humble, totally anonymous collection of poems did exactly that. This wasn't just any book of poetry. It held the seeds of a revolution, one that was about to completely reshape English literature as we know it. So let's get into it. Let's talk about how this one book, Lyrical Ballads, sparked an entire movement. To really get what was going on, you have to feel the vibe of the late 18th century. And this quote from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau just nails it. It was this age of massive change, of feeling stuck, and this burning desire for freedom. This wasn't just some philosophical musings. It was basically the soundtrack for an era of rebellion, and it set the stage for a radical new way of thinking, not just in politics, but in art itself.
So, to understand just how radical this new vision was, we first have to look at what it was rebelling against. See, this was the end of the Enlightenment, an era that was all about order, logic, and reason. And believe me, the poetry of the time definitely reflected that.
And this slide really just lays out the battle lines, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the poetry of the establishment. It was super formal, very academic. It used what the Romantics later called priggish, learned language. Basically, it was poetry for the elites about these lofty, classical subjects. But on the other side, you had this completely wild new idea, that poetry should be about real, raw, human emotion, that it should speak in the language of everyday people and find its power not in palaces, but out in the countryside among the poor and the ordinary.
And this is where our main characters enter the scene. Two poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who decided to put this radical idea to the test. They were about to launch a literary experiment that would become the opening shot of the Romantic Revolution.
And here it is, Lyrical Ballads. Thing is, it came out anonymously, with a pretty unassuming title. No one at the time could have possibly guessed that this little collection, which included Coleridge's absolute masterpiece, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, would become a landmark text. Really, the official starting point of English Romanticism.
And they weren't shy about what they were doing. Wordsworth himself, right there in the book's introduction, doesn't say these are perfect, polished works of art. No, he calls them experiments. This was them deliberately testing a theory. Could the language of ordinary conversation, the language of the middle and lower classes, actually be used to create real poetry? It was a direct challenge to, well, everything. So you have to understand, this was basically a manifesto in verse. The goals were crystal clear. Tear down the walls that made poetry something only for the educated elite. They wanted to write in a way that felt real, that sounded like someone actually speaking. They wanted to give a voice to the voiceless, the farm worker, the child, the forgotten soldier. Their whole bet was that deep down, human emotions are universal, and that the simple language of the poor could express them with a power and an energy that learned poetry had totally lost.
Now, an experiment this radical doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Wordsworth and Coleridge were breathing in the air of a world that was being violently transformed, both by shocking new technologies and by earth-shattering political ideas.
I mean, all around them, the Industrial Revolution was changing everything. The green and pleasant land of England was getting scarred by factories, smoke, and noise. People were flooding into these crowded, dirty cities, and a lot of writers saw this new world of machines and repetitive labor as something that was profoundly dehumanizing, stripping people of their connection to nature and to themselves.
And at the exact same time, the French Revolution was sending shockwaves across all of Europe. For young artists in England, it was at first this incredibly exciting symbol of liberation, of throwing off a corrupt old system. But then, as the revolution descended into the Reign of Terror, that hope got mixed with this deep fear of chaos and violence.
And when you lay these events out on a timeline like this, it just clicks, doesn't it? The social chaos from industrialization, the political earthquake of the French Revolution, and then boom, Lyrical Ballads in 1798. It wasn't just a book of poems. It was a direct artistic response to this exact moment of intense change, anxiety, and incredible possibility. So what started out as an experiment in 1798 pretty quickly hardened into a full-blown artistic philosophy. Just a couple of years later, in the preface to the second edition, Wordsworth basically laid out the core principles of what we now call Romanticism.
So what even is Romanticism? Well, at its heart, it's a rebellion. It's pushing back against the Enlightenment's obsession with pure reason. The Romantics basically said, hey, emotion, intuition, your personal experience, those are just as important for understanding the world, maybe even more so. They champion the power of the individual spirit and look to nature as a source of truth, beauty, and healing.
So what were the pillars of this new worldview? Well, first off, they believed the imagination wasn't just for daydreaming. It was this powerful, almost divine force that could literally heal and transform you. Then you've got their view of children, who they saw as these pure, wise beings who hadn't been corrupted by society yet. Of course, nature was their church, a place you could go for spiritual renewal. And finally, they were obsessed with this idea of the sublime. You know that feeling of overwhelming awe and maybe even a little bit of terror that you get when you're faced with the immense power of nature, like a giant mountain range or a raging storm? That's the sublime.
And this quote, this incredible quote from the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, just perfectly captures how the Romantics saw themselves. They didn't think they were just entertainers, not at all. They felt they were almost like prophets, these figures who had a special duty to interpret the world and guide humanity through tough times. For them, poetry wasn't just art. It had a profound social and spiritual job to do.
Now, the revolution that started with lyrical ballads definitely didn't end with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Its ideas just kept echoing through the generations, creating totally new kinds of stories and, maybe more importantly, new kinds of heroes that are absolutely still with us today.
You could say the first generation of Romantics kicked the door open, and then this second generation, we're talking figures like the rebellious Lord Byron, the radical Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the brilliant John Keats, they just came storming right through it. Each one of them added their own unique voice and intensity to the movement.
And one of the most lasting things to come out of this era was from Lord Byron. The man didn't just write poetry, he created a whole new kind of hero, the Byronic hero. This is the outsider, the rebel. He's moody, he's mysterious, he's totally cynical about society's rules, but for some reason, he's also incredibly charismatic and attractive. Sound familiar?
Because you can see the DNA of this character absolutely everywhere. He is the direct ancestor of some of literature's most iconic characters, like the tortured Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights or the brooding Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. But it's more than that. The Byronic hero is literally the blueprint for the modern anti-hero that we see all over our movies and TV shows. That flawed, difficult protagonist that we just can't help but root for.
So we end on this thought. The Romantics looked at the factories and the machines of their time, and they fought back with art that celebrated human emotion, individuality, and the natural world. It really makes you wonder, right? As we navigate our own technological revolutions, AI, social media, the whole shebang, what is our art saying in response? How are our stories, our songs, our films challenging the world we live in today? It's a big question, but it's one the Romantics would have definitely understood.